how do they know what or who started the Palisades fire, a blaze that destroyed thousands of homes in Los Angeles, consumed over 20,000 acres, and took 12 lives?
This is madness.
I'm gonna get your walker down.
Yeah, let's get out of here.
Oh, I didn't take anything.
It's heartbreaking. Completely destroyed.
Months after the rubble was cleared, the government offered up a culprit.
Today, we are announcing the arrest of 29-year-old Jonathan Rinderknecht for igniting a fire that ultimately burned down the Palisades.
The prosecutors released some juicy details. Rinderknecht had prompted ChatGPT to create images of a divided, burning world. He was the child of Baptist missionaries, and he'd recently described the liberating feeling of burning a Bible. In the days before the fire, he'd searched the terms Free Luigi Mangione and watched this music video on repeat. But there are two more details that make this case even stranger. First, everyone agrees that Rinderknecht was nowhere near the Palisades on January 7th. And second, his lawyer kept pointing out,
there's not a single shred of evidence that Jonathan Rinderknecht started that fire.
So the question is, how can the government be sure that Rinderknecht did it?
How do they know? I mean, yeah, with arson, you'd think that the evidence was destroyed.
Right, exactly. This episode isn't just about this one case. It's about the whole field of wildfire forensics. What clues do investigators look for? How reliable are those clues? Can science tell us if a fire was an accident or a crime? Fire investigators tend to work backwards. To figure out what started a fire, you first have to rewind the clock to find out exactly where it started.
So you start with origin determination. Where did the fire start? Hopefully you get that origin down to a very small area, maybe 10 by 10 feet, 100 square feet would be wonderful.
A lot of people I talked to for this piece recommended I reach out to Keith Parker. Fire investigators like him use the basics of fire behavior to get a rough sense of how a fire developed. In an extremely simplified scenario, a fire moves uniformly outwards. So the origin is at the very center. But a lot of factors can complicate this. There's topography. It's easier for a fire to travel uphill. Fuel is also a factor. Fire can only go where it has something to burn. And rain and humidity can make it harder for a fire to spread. And then, of course, there's wind. What you often get is this sort of V or U shape, and the fire tends to be most intense at the leading edge. Advancing fire, they call it. And then the backing fire, that tends to be like sort of a low smolder. Now let's apply all this to the Palisades fire. I pulled this topography data from this cool website by Peter Richardson. Black is sea level, whiter equals higher elevations. And in calm conditions, you'd expect fire to travel up to the ridgetops. I then grabbed some weather data from NOAA. This is the rainfall over the course of an average year in LA, and this is 2024. There was a weird amount of rain in February that led to a lot of foliage springing up, and then after 8 months of basically no rain, you get a bunch of dry kindling. Finally, here's a visualization of the wind the day the Palisades fire started. It's from this really cool project by Cameron Beccario. At midnight, it's calm over land. There's faster winds out at sea.
Okay, and these are the Santa Anas coming in?
Exactly. So if this wind is the main driver of the fire's spread...
It's got to start at the top then, right? It couldn't have gone in the other direction.
It's a good guess. That's confirmed by this photo that was snapped by a passing European satellite at 10:45 a.m. Once you have your general origin area, you need to narrow it down. And this guide, this is sort of the Bible of wildland fire investigations, explains the clues that are used to do that. Some of them are kind of surprising. For example, you can look at grass stems. In an advancing fire, flames might shear off the tops of stems at an angle. But with a low backing fire, that would burn the base first and the stems fall over, and so they end up pointing back towards the origin. Here's another clue. Leaves can become pliable in heat and bend in the direction of the wind, and then as they cool, they freeze in place. There's a bunch more. Objects on the ground can protect their leeward side. There are distinct char patterns in trees and their canopies, chipping patterns on rocks, soot deposits. The guide lists 11 indicators that reveal the path a fire took. In this photo, each of the little flags represents a place where they've found one of these clues.
Ah, okay.
And so you're going across the landscape in sort of a regular pattern.
You begin by collecting data, and you need to do that without bias, and that means you need to not be expecting anything. And then once you collect all the dots, then you start connecting the dots.
And in a perfect world, that leads you back to a specific origin area.
And how did they figure all this out?
So Fire investigations really started with a focus on fires in houses and buildings, not on wildfires.
Structure fire investigation had always been based on, oh, this person has done it for the past 20 years. They know it, everything, and they taught me, so I know everything. You couldn't open up a book or go to a study and find where did that come from.
In 1990, there was a landmark case that changed everything. Investigators found patterns that were supposed to only happen when an arsonist poured gasoline on the floor. Pour patterns, they called them. But an outside researcher decided to test that conventional wisdom. The house next door had been condemned, but it had an identical layout, and they got permission to burn it down. And during the mock fire, just airflows managed to create these exact same pour patterns, even though the researchers had not poured any type of accelerant. In this case, the charges were dropped, but in another case, a suspect got the death penalty based partly on the same type of discredited evidence.
And unfortunately, we executed a man in Texas based on bad science.
They didn't even know what they didn't know because they didn't do science.
Right.
I covered forensic science before, and I was really shocked by how much the system encouraged these kinds of overconfident, because they're basically getting paid to testify in court. And so you would go to the investigators who can kind of deliver that opinion most persuasively.
Oftentimes, there's a desire for a strong, definitive answer with somebody who has very deep pockets to blame.
Right.
And all of that is very contrary to how we know science works, where you really want to be transparent about the uncertainties, not necessarily tell the cleanest story, and be open to not knowing everything.
These cases were kind of a wake-up call for structural fire investigators, and they started rigorously testing all these clues that they had taken as gospel. Doing these kind of experiments, trying to create the conditions of a fire in a controlled setting where you can watch the fire develop, gave them all kinds of insights into how reliable the indicators they were using were.
The wildfire investigation it avoided that kind of scrutiny.
Keith is one of only a handful of people trying to validate wildfire indicators by doing careful field experiments.
It's so difficult to do these studies because the amount of work is tremendous. We went down to Fort San Luis and we set up these plots, and we started a fire in a center point, covered it by drones.
They could see the direction the fire was actually traveling at every point in the plot. And after the fire, they took pictures of different artifacts from every angle.
I found 4 volunteers that were very highly trained and experienced wildland fire investigators. And we asked what direction was the fire coming from, and then can you tell if it was advancing fire, backing fire, or lateral fire?
These are the results. If this is the true direction of the fire, this is the average number of degrees the experts were off by in either direction.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
This is bad.
You could have gone out and taken each one of these, flipped a coin, and you would have had the same percentile.
Right. The outcome of the study was not what might have been anticipated, they note.
Because these were already indicators that were in handbooks that have been used for a long time.
These are still the indicators that wildland fire investigators are using. I only found one other field study from a decade ago, and the results were similar. The indicators didn't consistently point to the true direction of the fire.
Do they have any sense of why these indicators aren't as useful as they might seem?
Well, I should first say that Parker, he still believes in a lot of these indicators. He still thinks that they're very useful, despite his study.
A lot of people read it as what we were saying is you can't interpret fire pattern indicators to come up with where a fire cause was. We know this stuff works because we find accurate fires. We all oftentimes find fires that we go back later and find video evidence or other evidence that confirms our findings. So we know there's a lot to this.
Clearly, these indicators work sometimes, but maybe they only work when the fire is at a sort of medium intensity.
As you get to each end of that spectrum, those patterns become less pronounced.
In Keith's study, the wind was low and inconsistent, so maybe the fire never reached an intensity where it would leave more definitive patterns. And in the older study, the fire was very intense.
The fuel in the advancing fire and the fuel in the backing fire all consume 100%, and all you're left with is ash.
Another study I found from just last year didn't go out in the field. It simulated wildfires in a wind tunnel. Some indicators showed up as expected, some varied a lot depending on the starting conditions. These studies show that the clues just aren't always that reliable or clear.
Investigators go out and it's very difficult. You're not seeing the fire pattern indicators that you've been taught to look for, and you start assigning patterns to things that really aren't valid.
So in the Palisades fire, investigators had a tough job.
Good morning. My name is Kenny Cooper. I'm the special agent in charge of ATF's Los Angeles Field Division.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is in charge of federal arson investigations.
We processed hundreds of acres of damaged fire, examining every inch.
Are the investigators trying to find the origin immediately? Or do they wait until it kind of runs its course and then go in and try to figure out how it started?
Ideally, you want to look for it as soon as humanly possible, because the more time that passes, the more evidence can be destroyed. Wind or rain could come up and destroy things. People can visit and tramp all over the area. Unfortunately, they didn't get to this for another 5 days. Luckily, UC San Diego deployed all these cameras that are specifically looking for fires starting out.
Oh, okay.
So there was one less than a mile away on a water tower, and this is like the first puffs of smoke. And so they could narrow in on a pretty small area.
We literally had agents on their hands and knees crawling through fire debris. They're observing fire behavior patterns.
You can see, again, the advancing fire, the lateral fire, and the backing fire. The yellow circle is where they say the fire started. The defense in this case is already trying to call that into question. You follow the arrows back to the origin. So if these red arrows indicate the advancing fire,
why are they over there?
But the ATF was satisfied that they'd narrowed in on the specific origin area where they could start looking for evidence of what exactly ignited the Palisades fire.
We went through exhaustive efforts to look at potential ignition sources.
You've got potential natural causes, so lightning strikes is a common one. The ATF consulted a database of lightning strikes detected by this network of sensors, and they found no lightning storms between January 1st and January 7th within 100 kilometers of the Palisades. Lava is another potential cause. Probably not a lot of lava in the hills above LA. There sometimes have been fires that have been started by rocks falling and sparking off each other. Super rare, but it's been documented.
Wow.
There were no rock falls in this area. So now we get into human causes. Did any power lines go down or spark? There were no reports of that around the Palisades fire. Vehicles can be dragging something that sparks along a road. You can have fireworks, cigarettes, you can have arson. But sort of from the beginning, people were suspicious of another possible cause, which was embers from another fire that had broken out a week earlier on the same hillside.
The Lockman fire, was that a big one? Or is that like a little one that they put out quickly?
It was a little one. It was just about 8 to 10 acres. This water tower up at the top, that's where these cameras from UCSD were. And then all of a sudden,
boom,
there's this conflagration on the top of the hill.
Wow. So we know exactly what time.
It was around just after midnight. By sunrise, they had already contained it, and by the afternoon, they were confident that it was extinguished. But after the Palisades fire, journalists and community members were asking, hey, there was that little fire a week before the Palisades fire started. Could that have anything to do with it? And the fire department basically said no.
That fire was dead out. If it is determined that was the cause, it would be a phenomenon.
We won't leave a fire that has any hot spots. The team that we have on board right now will be able to determine whether or not that did indeed happen.
And months later, the Fed said that did indeed happen.
The fire was a holdover fire, meaning it was deeply seated in dense vegetation and roots and continued to burn undetected until catastrophic weather ensued, resulting in the Palisades fire.
That's quite a stretch between when that ended and then the next fire.
Yeah, we're not going to get into the full fire response. I'll just tell you the fire department did respond, and they don't say they put out fires, they suppress the fire.
So this is kind of a touchy subject because there's a parallel investigation to see if LA's fire department messed up somehow. And as part of that, they interviewed some of the firefighters who were on the ground that day after the Lockman fire.
I noticed hot coals underneath the ashes. I could feel the heat coming off of it, and I didn't even want to use my gloved hand because it was hot. I haven't really spoken much on it because it kind of sits heavy with me that nobody listened to me.
Beyond these depositions, there isn't really a lot out in the public about why they're so confident it's a holdover. Their court filings just say that they found roots that had been smoldering.
Like we said, there was dense vegetation. The fire went underground.
If holdover fire is a thing, is there precedent that some person who starts the first fire can be held responsible for the second fire? Like, how could they possibly have, with intent, started that one?
Right. There's some sort of legal analogies that people have tried to draw that if you, for example, stab a person and they're brought to the hospital and their wound was one that could have been, properly sewn up,
repaired,
but the doctor in the ER botches that operation, you're still on the hook for murdering them. It's not like the doctor takes the responsibility because you were the proximate cause.
You did the stabbing.
You did the stabbing, so it doesn't matter if the doctor messed up. And the government in particular, the fire department, has a lot of immunity in these situations because they don't want the firefighters to be afraid to do their jobs. In any case, if you accept this explanation that the Lockman fire seeded the Palisades fire, you have to start all over again with a new mystery, one that will bring us closer to our prime suspect. What caused the Lockman fire? Real quick, we put a lot of work into these episodes, whether that's making pastel fire animations or reading hundreds of court documents. And if you'd like to support this curious, skeptical journalism, please subscribe here on YouTube and also on Patreon. We couldn't do this without our Patreon community. Okay, back to the mystery. In the immediate aftermath of the Lockman fire, a lot of the locals were thinking that it was fireworks. New Year's, people are setting off fireworks.
Yeah.
People are being dumb in the hills.
I saw some reports that they said there was definitely no any fireworks in that area, and a white flash and a loud bang, I clearly witnessed that.
He looked up on the hill and took this photo right around the start of the Lockman fire. There we have one hypothesis is fireworks, sort of the default that you'd expect.
On New Year's Eve.
Well, in October, when the ATF makes their arrest, they have a completely different story.
Late last New Year's Eve, Rinderknecht returned to Pacific Palisades after working the evening shift as an Uber driver.
Messages reveal he'd recently been spurned by an ex, and Uber passengers say he was in a bad mood before he drove up to the Skull Rock trailhead.
He exited the car, walked up a nearby trail, took iPhone videos at a nearby hilltop.
There was some early speculation about this flash of light. Maybe those are fireworks actually being lit. But the ATF says, no, that's his car.
Headlights.
And this little light on the hill might be him using a flashlight or his phone light to go up this trail.
At some point up there, around 12:12 a.m., he ignited a fire.
Shortly after that, Rinderknecht started a screen recording on his phone that captured several attempts to call 911.
He took a screen recording while calling 911. That's interesting.
Also on the screen recording is him talking to ChatGPT. Are you at fault if a fire is lit because of your cigarettes?
Okay. Well, maybe he was just smoking.
So one of the questions is, was he smoking and this was accidental, or was he trying to plant the idea that this was all a mistake? The ATF says
the fire was ignited with an open flame.
And so we're sort of left, after all of this hullabaloo, with three hypothetical causes: fireworks, a potentially accidental cigarette, and arson, an open flame from a lighter. These possibilities can lead to very different charges and sentences. So can forensic science help us distinguish between these options? Well, remember,
you begin by collecting data, and you need to do that without bias.
The trail is even colder at this point, right? Because they're not doing this investigation until after the Palisades fire. But these are the indicators that they documented. Where would you put the origin of the fire based on these arrows?
Well, there's some red arrows that are confusing me, but would it be number 4?
That's where the ATF identified the origin. But you can see that there's some red arrows to the left of that.
From 3.
They initially identified 3 as the origin.
Okay.
Then they came back a few days later and walked around again and identified site 4, which would certainly put the origin closer to where we know Jonathan Rinderknecht was.
It's not like a double-blind kind of investigation, like the fire investigator who's looking at this and then going back and looking at it. He knows what else is developing from, I guess, the police investigation. Could you plausibly suspect that he has changed his story because he knows that they've put a suspect in that other place?
Right. Well, this is the big question, and I'm sure this will be litigated in the courtroom.
Okay.
Because the handbook says, don't make any predeterminations about what the cause is.
I do a lot of casework now on the private side, and as I review the reports, it becomes generally very apparent when an investigator went out looking for a cause. You start looking for a cause and then develop your origin around it. And that is a totally invalid methodology and almost always leads to inaccurate conclusions.
The ATF's full investigation is not currently public, so it's hard to evaluate exactly how they came to their conclusions.
I just want to assure everyone, ATF did not identify this suspect and focus specifically on this suspect. We still utilize our scientific process.
And part of their process was to return to the hypothesized origin site and recreate the firelight with a butane torch.
ATF will be conducting a controlled fire testing Tuesday, April 29th through Thursday, May 1st.
And see how fixed surveillance points saw that fire as it developed in the exact lunar time that the fire started.
They're trying to recreate the security cam footage.
Right. We're going to go out, start a fire where we think the fire started. Is it at least consistent with what was seen on the cameras? And apparently it was. The ATF was satisfied they'd found the specific origin, so they were back to searching for ignition clues. If you're lucky, you might find cigarettes or matches or firework casings or chemical traces of gasoline.
It's an extremely tedious process. You have to take breaks because your eyes, you start looking at similar black stuff.
Meanwhile, they worked to rule out other potential causes. They said there was no lightning, no downed power lines, and contrary to some witnesses, no fireworks.
We have no evidence that any fireworks were set off in this area at the time the fire ignited.
Then they did some analysis back at their lab.
They analyzed humidity, the exact temperature, recreated those environmental factors in our labs, then tested different ignition sources. And that's where 500 tests were conducted at that lab.
According to the court documents, all 500 of these tests were to see if cigarettes would quickly light these dishes of fuel. Apparently some of them smoldered, but none of them actually ignited. An expert for the defense claimed that these tests were too humid and that the angle of the cigarette and the lack of dangling fuel made ignition less likely. And the defense keeps returning to this argument.
There's not a single shred of evidence that Jonathan Rinderknecht started that fire.
No one saw Rinderknecht light the fire, and ATF searches of the origin didn't turn up any evidence. No likely ignition sources, which is how a lot of wildland fire arsons have been proven in the past. This brings us to another problem that is often discussed in court cases around arson investigations, which is this idea of negative corpus. You don't find evidence of arson, but you haven't found evidence of anything else.
Process of elimination.
There was a high-profile case where a Navy ship caught on fire.
Wow.
And one of the seamen was charged with arson. There's a ProPublica piece about this case, and they say that the investigator, an ATF agent named Matthew Beals, ruled out accidental causes as well as natural ones. With those causes eliminated, he concluded it must have been arson.
I don't like it.
Right, and that's why, in this case, the person who was accused was acquitted. Significantly, the lead investigator on that case is one of the lead investigators of the Palisades fire. It's also worth noting, though, that it's easy to start a wildfire without leaving a trace.
Typically, wildland fires, they start them in light fuels where you can, as we used to say, click your Bic. You could just reach down and apply a flame to it and off it goes.
We are confident that the burden of proof by the government on this presumed innocent person will be met in trial.
So I'm going to take you inside that courtroom in just a second. But first, we've talked about how fire investigators are trying to figure out what actually works versus just doing what they've always done. And I want to apply that same philosophy to shaving. Most razors that we're used to seeing have these flexible heads, right, that move around. And it's supposed to help contour to your body. But can you think of any downsides to that?
Downside? Is it less hygienic?
Well, a lot of these blade designs are harder to clean, but there's a bigger downside, which is when a blade isn't rigidly supported, it can get deflected. It cuts one hair cleanly, but then others are kind of tugged because it's not at the right angle. And so you instinctually, in response to this, often press harder with the razor to sort of like try and stabilize it.
Sure.
And that means you're getting more pressure on your skin, and that leads to razor burn. Enter this machine shop in Canada. They make aerospace parts, so they're very detail-oriented. And they designed this razor that has a single fixed blade that's rigidly supported. And that means when you use it, there's no instability, and you can get a precise shave with a lighter touch.
Ooh.
It's very...
It looks nice.
Very sleek. And you can visit hensonshaving.com/Howtown and use code Howtown to receive 100 free blades. That's more than a 2-year supply of blades.
That's a lot.
With the purchase of a razor. Make sure both products are in the cart for the code to take effect. So let's get into the trial and the chaotic way it ended. It started on June 8th, 2026, with some ground rules laid down by the judge. The prosecution wasn't allowed to bring up certain details from Jonathan's past, like the Bible burning, because that might prejudice the jury. And the defense wasn't allowed to blame the fire department for letting the Lockman fire smolder and reignite. That was judged a separate issue that's certain to be addressed in some other lawsuits that are currently pending. Rinderknecht faced 3 federal charges and a maximum of 45 years in prison. All the charges required malice or intent, and so the prosecution spent a lot of time trying to establish the mental state of their suspect, weaving together a bunch of YouTube searches and text messages and ChatGPT conversations to paint a picture of a man who was lonely and broke and bitter and who wanted to get revenge on the world. In an 8-hour interview with agent Matthew Beals, Rinderknecht expressed a lot of anger about the inequalities in society. And in this same interview, his account of New Year's didn't exactly match the locations from his phone records.
During his interview, he lied about where he was when he first saw the Lockman fire, claiming he was near the bottom of a hiking trail.
When it came to the forensic evidence, the ATF's expert fire investigator argued that it pointed to arson. But the defense brought in their own experienced fire investigator who argued the evidence was inconclusive and fireworks were still a valid theory. One firefighter testified that he hadn't seen or heard any fireworks in the area, but then another firefighter testified that he had. On June 24th, the jury was sent out to sort through all this and make their final decision. But on June 25th, they sent the judge a note.
Just a bizarre set of circumstances.
There seems to be chaos there.
I've never seen this happen.
The jury is deadlocked.
Deadlocked, and we don't have a verdict. A judge has just declared a mistrial.
And so, after all that, this trial is over. The government has already announced that they'll try to get a conviction again in a new trial scheduled for October. 2 of the jurors had insisted that Rinderknecht was guilty, but the other 10 disagreed. After the trial ended, juror number 4 said there just wasn't enough evidence. The scene of the crime had remained open and unexamined for over a week. But on top of all that, I think that the forensic science has some work to do. These indicators need to be tested and validated so they can reliably pinpoint a fire's origin and lead to evidence that could catch an arsonist or exonerate an innocent suspect. As fire risk increases in the West, these tools are going to become more and more important. As with every Howtown episode, we've got a document with all our key sources in the description. And today I just wanted to specifically thank some local journalists who helped me follow this story. We've got Eric Leonard, Matthias Gaffney, Julie Johnson at the San Francisco Chronicle, at the LA Times, Aileen Chekmidian, Paul Pringle, Richard Winton, and Hannah Fry.